Hello and welcome to another edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we celebrate one of the worst anniversaries in recent history, and this is the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Now, this is a music show, and so while talking about the overall significance of that terrible day, I also want to talk about the music that surrounded President Kennedy, both in life and death. Now, Kennedy's campaign was one that was really filled with optimism, and one of the things that helped convey this message of optimism was a song, a Frank Sinatra song. Now, Sinatra was a major celebrity backer of Kennedy. He raised funds for the Kennedy campaign, was very vocal about his support, and he also provided a campaign song, possibly the most well-known campaign song of the 20th century, and this was High Hopes. Now, the song wasn't specifically written for the Kennedy campaign. It was originally from a film from 1959 that Sinatra was in, and the film was called, quite ironically, A Hole in the Head. But the song, with some rewritten lyrics to get the name Jack Kennedy in, became a major theme of the Kennedy campaign. Now, he, of course, won in November of 1960, and he remained very popular among the musical community, not just Sinatra, but people like Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Bing Crosby, all of the real sort of mega stars of the day. And of course, people like Harry Belafonte supported him as well. Great film stars like Charlton Heston supported him. Really one of the first presidential candidates and first presidents to actively court superstars from the world of entertainment. That just wasn't done to that degree in previous generations. And that really set a standard for the convergence of the world of arts, culture, and entertainment and politics for future generations. Now, fast forwarding to this day in 1963, we all know what happened. We're not on this platform allowed to say who did it, but I think the more discerning of you in the audience already know. And it was a tragic event. Now, this was, of course, before the age of the internet, but broadcast television and radio were in full swing, and people were given the news in various localities, particularly on radio, that was more localized than the television networks at the time. And it was really interesting to hear the various ways that the news was broken. Now, there was a musical connection in terms of how the news was broken in Boston, which was, of course, a very important city for the Kennedy family. And it was during a concert conducted by Eric Leinsdorf of the Boston Symphony. And before they were to perform, I believe this was actually, if memory serves me right, it was at the intermission between the first and second halves of the concert, and the conductor, in his thick foreign accent, Eric Leinsdorf, very underrated conductor, frankly. Check out his recording of the Egyptian Helen, an aria called the Awakening Scene, I believe, sung by Leontine Price, recorded on RCA Living Stereo. Wonderful. But back to what we were talking about. So Leinsdorf gets on the microphone, and this was broadcast over the radio because the Boston Symphony concert was being broadcast on the radio. So it just so happened that he had a larger audience than he would have had if it was just for the people in Boston Symphony Hall. So Leinsdorf talked to the crowd about the reports that President Kennedy had been shot, and the sort of the from the audience, and women shrieking and crying, and just it's audible in the radio broadcast. And as a tribute, in lieu of regular programming, he played the second movement to the Third Symphony of Beethoven, the funeral march from Beethoven's Eroica. And it's really interesting not just to hear that clip, which luckily is on YouTube, but to hear how the news was reported and how people reacted to it in various parts of the US. There's other video, or film rather, because it was film, from the streets of Boston where people were uniformly sad. That was a city very close to Kennedy. There was another very interesting video from New Orleans where he was considerably less popular. and another video from San Diego where his popularity was somewhere in between. And that reflects the regional divisions of the US at the time. The Northeast, where as a sort of forward-looking Democrat, he was very popular. The South, where he was seen as betraying the Democratic Party's values of the South, which were more socially segregationist, for instance, but it was more complex than that. But that's sort of the bite-sized version. And then there was the West, which, while it didn't have the sort of racial politics of the South or the family politics of the Northeast, was generally more Republican in those days, generally for commercial reasons. So you could see that all these people say things are divided like they've never been divided before, says some idiot on television. No, that's not true at all. What is true is that ethics and decorum and manners have slipped so that these divisions, instead of being expressed boldly but politely, are being expressed through hysteria and the inability to communicate effectively. That's what's changed. The country was deeply divided in 1960, which is why the people who got away with it did get away with it in 1963 on that fateful day. I'm sure the more discerning of those among you on this highly censored channel can read between those lines. So back to the musical connection. In January of 1964, a major memorial service was held. This was around 2 months after the assassination, and Eric Leinsdorf, the conductor, appears again because he conducts Mozart's Requiem in a major mass, a Requiem mass celebrated in a Roman Catholic church, celebrated by the local cardinal for the slain President Kennedy. And as Leinsdorf was signed to RCA, which was their Living Stereo series, was a great audiophile quality series of music in the 50s and 60s into the very early 70s. We have that recording, and it's now on your Spotify's and your Tidals and your Apples and everywhere else. And I strongly encourage you to listen to it because it is a moment of history where the world of classical music and the world of Kennedy's sad death intersected for the second time, because it was Leinsdorf who made the announcement. Now, in subsequent years, the name Kennedy, in terms of President John Kennedy and his assassination, has been referenced in music many times, in folk music, in rock music, in pop music, in hip hop, so many different genres. I mean, from the late 60s, there was the Dion song Abraham Martin and John, which reflected on the assassinations of Jack Kennedy, his brother Bobby Kennedy, the senator from New York, who was slain in 1968. Again, we know what happened. We're not allowed to say it here. You can hear it said elsewhere. And it also reflects on the death from assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Very interesting song. It was said that one of my favorite Beach Boys songs, In the Warmth of the Sun, was inspired by the general feelings of somberness, but trying to keep at it after the assassination, although the song makes no references to the assassination. And in later years, as the world lost its innocence, you have um, other songs that are a bit less mournful and more sardonic, let's say. But again, whenever a tragic event goes through the passage of time, the emotional connection and the mourning we feel, at least among some, tends to decrease. It remains for some who were particularly close to the subject who was killed. But for others, the emotional gravity of the incident tends to decrease, so much so that by the 1980s, a very politically active band was called the Dead Kennedys. And I have to say that its leader at the time, Jello Biafra, was a great free speech activist at a time when the PMRC was doing their censorial horrible things in the 1980s that Frank Zappa stood against. And so everything does kind of come full circle. So, those are some of the musical connections to the life and to the death of President Kennedy. Leave your comments if you have any particular musical memories. And as always, like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.